Certainly. I can rewrite the story in English, restoring the sexual undertones and keeping the American names and main setting. Here is the story with those elements reintroduced. The old cottage stood on the edge of town in Maine, its siding faded with time, its walls whispering tales of bygone days. For me, Margaret, it was more than a home. It was a monument to the life John and I had built together, a life that had, over the years, grown as quiet and faded as the cottage itself. I moved through its rooms with a muted grace, my days measured by routine and a soft hum of solitude. My marriage to John, once a vibrant promise, had settled into a comfortable but emotionally barren existence. We were companions, respectful of each other's space, but the spark that had ignited our love had long since died down to embers. John, a man of the land, spent his days in the garden, his hands rough with soil and labor, his gaze more often on the horizon than on me. Our conversations were practical, our interactions polite, but devoid of the warmth that once defined us. I'd grown used to the quiet, but it lay heavy in my heart. There were moments when the memory of our early connection flickered, laughter, shared dreams, but they were ghosts, quickly swallowed by the weight of time and routine. Then came word of Cody's visit. John's nephew, a young man I barely knew from family gatherings, would be staying for the summer. Cody was in his early 20s, brimming with a youthful energy that felt foreign in our stillness. His presence promised change, a ripple in the pond of our quiet life. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me welcomed the company, the break in routine, but another part resisted the intrusion into my carefully constructed solitude. When Cody arrived, he unfolded himself from the car with a backpack slung over one shoulder, a smile that seemed to brighten the dusty driveway. He greeted John with a handshake, then turned to me, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that went beyond polite courtesy. "It's so good to see you again, Aunt Margaret," he said, and the casual warmth in his voice sent an unexpected flutter through me, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. The first days were a flurry of activity. Cody was eager to help, joining John in the garden, offering a hand with chores, his youthful energy a stark contrast to John's quiet, methodical movements. He even offered to help me in the kitchen, his presence filling the space that had long been mine alone. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in years, the cottage felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home again. I found myself anticipating his company, the way he listened with genuine interest as I spoke of the garden or old family stories, the sound of his laughter unexpectedly vibrant in the quiet rooms. As days bled into weeks, a subtle shift occurred within me. I found myself noticing Cody in ways that were different. The casual ease of his smile, the way his eyes lingered on mine a moment longer than necessary, the almost accidental brush of his hand against my arm as we passed in the narrow hallway. Each small interaction sparked something unfamiliar, a warmth that spread from my stomach to my chest. It was a sensation I recognized, but had long since buried, a ghost of feelings I thought time had withered. I tried to dismiss these stirrings, to label them as mere fondness for a kind young man, a welcome break from the monotony, but the subtle pull was undeniable, a gentle current drawing me closer. One evening, as the sun bled orange and rose across the horizon, Cody and I found ourselves alone on the porch. John had retreated indoors, leaving us to the twilight and the quiet hum of crickets. We sat in a comfortable silence, the air cooling around us. "Aunt Margaret," Cody began, his voice low and steady, "I feel like I can talk to you about anything. You just understand things." I turned to him, my breath catching slightly, my heart doing a strange, unfamiliar dance in my chest. "You can talk to me, Cody," I managed, the words a soft murmur. "Always?" He shifted, turning to face me more fully, his eyes searching mine in the fading light. "There's something," he hesitated, a tremor in his voice, "something I feel. For you?" My breath hitched, a sudden dryness in my throat. I had felt it too, the unspoken undercurrent between us, a silent hum of attraction, but to hear him voice it aloud made it dangerous, thrilling. I reached out, almost involuntarily, and touched his cheek, the warmth of his skin surprising against my fingertips. "Cody," I whispered, my voice barely audible, breathy. This is complicated. He leaned closer, the scent of his skin, clean and young, filling my senses. His gaze dropped to my lips, and then, with a hesitant breath, his mouth brushed against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, soft, questioning, and then, as if a dam had broken, it deepened, a sudden rush of warmth and something akin to desperation. It was a kiss that spoke of unspoken longings, of a yearning that mirrored my own secret desires. When we broke apart, breathless, the air between us charged, my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm against the sudden silence of the crickets. We shouldn't, I said, the words catching in my throat, a fragile whisper of protest. This is wrong, Cody. You're young and I'm your aunt. The word felt hollow, inadequate, a flimsy barrier against the force of what had just passed between us. But you're not really my aunt, he argued, his voice thick with a passion that mirrored my own confused desires. Not by blood. Does that change things? I hesitated, the protest dying on my lips. The absence of blood relation did shift the rigid boundaries of family, offered a loophole, a crack in the moral wall. And in that crack, a dangerous seed of possibility took root. I cared for Cody, yes, but this was something else, something that resonated in a place that had been dormant for too long. The guilt was a cold knot in my stomach, but the longing was a fire, slowly awakening, threatening to consume everything. The days that followed Cody's confession were a blur of heightened awareness. Every touch, every glance, every shared breath felt charged, electric. I tried to maintain my routine, the garden, the kitchen, the quiet order of the cottage, but my mind was a battlefield, torn between duty and a dangerous, intoxicating desire. Each time Cody was near, my pulse quickened, a forbidden thrill racing through my veins. His presence was a constant, magnetic pull, drawing me in directions I knew, with a brittle, rational part of my mind, were forbidden. I told myself it was a fleeting infatuation, a temporary madness brought on by the summer heat and the novelty of his youth, something that would fade, must fade. But deep down, a reckless voice whispered that it was more than that it was something real, something vital. It was as if a part of me, long dormant, had suddenly, violently, sprung to life, and I was terrified and exhilarated by the awakening. Cody, too, was changed, the air around him thick with unspoken tension. He threw himself into work, laboring alongside John in the fields, mending fences with a feverish intensity. But there were moments, fleeting but potent, when our eyes would meet across the garden, across a room, and in his gaze I saw a mirror of my own inner turmoil, longing, confusion, a burning question hanging unspoken in the air between us. We didn't speak of the kiss, not directly, but it hung between us, heavy and undeniable, a silent pact, a dangerous secret point. One afternoon, working side by side in the flower garden, the scent of roses thick in the air, Cody broke the fragile silence. "Margaret," he said, my name on his lips sending a jolt through me, his voice low and husky. "I've been thinking about what I said. About us." The word hung in the air, charged and intimate. I froze, my hands stilled in the rich soil, the trowel falling forgotten at my side. I looked up at him, my heart aching with a mixture of fear and a dizzying hope. "Cody," I breathed, the name a soft exhale. We have to be careful. This isn't simple. Simple was a lifetime ago, before he arrived, before the air between us crackled with unspoken desire. He nodded, his expression a mixture of yearning and something akin to desperation. "I know," he said, stepping closer, closing the space between us until I could feel the warmth of his body radiating towards me. "But does it have to be simple? Does it have to be wrong just because it's us?" His hand reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, a feather-light touch that sent shivers down my spine. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Margaret. Especially not you or Uncle John." But he trailed off, his gaze locking with mine, the unspoken question hanging heavy between us, the sincerity in his voice, the raw emotion in his eyes, reached something deep within me, a place that had been starved for feeling. Almost against my will, my fingers intertwined with his, a silent surrender to the dangerous current pulling us together. "I know," I whispered again, the words barely audible, a promise and a plea, though I wasn't entirely sure what we were promising or pleading for. "We'll figure this out," I said, the words thin and unconvincing even to my own ears, knowing, in the secret, reckless heart of me, that figuring it out might mean surrendering to the very thing I knew I should resist. As the days turned into a breathless, dizzying rush, we found ourselves drawn together with an almost magnetic force. Every stolen moment, every lingering glance, every hushed conversation in the shadows of the porch or the hidden corners of the garden tightened the invisible threads that bound us. We'd steal away for long walks through the fields, ostensibly to escape the confines of the cottage, but really to be alone, to breathe the same air, to let the unspoken tension simmer between us. He spoke of his city life, of his restless spirit, of dreams that felt both vast and terrifyingly undefined. I, in turn, found myself sharing pieces of myself I hadn't voiced in years, fragments of my girlhood, the passionate, hopeful early days of my marriage, the slow, quiet sorrows that had settled like dust over the years. With each shared confidence, the forbidden bond between us deepened, twisted tighter, becoming a silken thread that threatened to become unbreakable, but the guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that stretched long and dark in the corners of my mind. Night after night, I lay sleepless, staring at the ceiling, the cottage creaking around me like a restless conscience. My thoughts were a torment, a relentless loop of what we were doing, the weight of it pressing down on me. John, oblivious, slept soundly beside me, his presence a silent accusation. I thought of him, of our vows, of the life we had built, slowly eroded by time and silence, now further fractured by my secret, dangerous desires. I thought of Cody, his youth, his future, the potential wreckage if we succumbed to this impossible pull. The weight of it all was almost unbearable, a crushing burden of desire and dread. One evening, the sky ablaze with the furious beauty of sunset, painting the porch in hues of fire and shadow, Cody and I found ourselves together again, drawn by an invisible current. The air was charged, the silence thick with unspoken words. The very air around us seemed to vibrate with tension. Finally, Cody broke the silence, his voice a low, desperate murmur. "Margaret," he said, my name a plea in the twilight, "I don't know what to do anymore. I can't keep fighting this. But I don't want to ruin everything either." His eyes, dark and tormented, searched mine, begging for an answer I didn't have. I turned to him, my own heart breaking at the raw vulnerability in his gaze. "I don't know either, Cody," I confessed, the words a choked whisper. "I'm lost too. But I know we can't keep going like this, dancing around the edge. It's not fair. Not to you, not to John, not to myself." He nodded slowly, the pain in his expression mirroring the turmoil within me. "I know," he breathed, the word heavy with resignation. "But how do we stop? How do we just walk away from this?" He gestured between us, to the charged air, the unspoken desire that bound us. I didn't have an answer, not one that satisfied the reckless, yearning part of me that had awakened with his arrival. The truth was, a terrifying, exhilarating part of me didn't want to walk away. Despite the guilt, despite the moral precipice looming before us, despite the knowledge that it was wrong, impossible, I didn't want to relinquish the connection we had found, this dangerous, forbidden spark. It was selfish, reckless, destructive. I knew all of that with a cold, rational corner of my mind. But the desire was real, a wildfire in dry grass, and that terrible, undeniable reality made it all the more impossible to resist. As summer began to loosen its grip, the days growing shorter, cooler, Cody's departure loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. The thought of him leaving, of returning to the flat line of my life with John, filled me with a cold dread, a suffocating emptiness. I had grown so used to his presence, to the dangerous thrill of his gaze, the stolen moments, the illicit possibility that the idea of returning to the quiet, solitary decay of my marriage felt unbearable. On his last night at the cottage, we found ourselves on the porch once more, as if drawn there by some unseen force, a silent ritual. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken words, the weight of everything we shouldn't say. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the mournful cry of a night bird in the distance. Finally, Cody turned to me, his eyes shadowed in the moonlight, filled with a mixture of sadness and a quiet, heartbreaking resolve. "Margaret," he said, my name a soft lament on his lips. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us. But I need you to know," he paused, his voice thick with emotion, "I'll never forget this summer. I'll never forget you. Never." Tears welled in my eyes, hot and unexpected, blurring the moonlight and the dark, yearning gaze of the young man beside me. Almost blindly, I reached out, my hand finding his in the darkness, our fingers lacing together, a fragile, desperate connection in the face of inevitable parting. "I'll never forget you either, Cody," I whispered, the words choked with unshed tears. "Never." We sat there, hand in hand, the silence stretching, heavy with unspoken desire and the weight of goodbye. It was a moment suspended in time, bittersweet and agonizing, a moment of impossible choice and inevitable loss. We held onto each other, two souls caught in a forbidden dance, knowing, with a stark, painful clarity, that our time was ending, that this dangerous, thrilling summer was drawing to a close. But even as the ache of parting settled in, there was a flicker of something else, a strange, defiant spark of acceptance. We had found something illicit, beautiful, dangerous, something that had irrevocably changed us both, ignited a fire that could never be fully extinguished. And even though we shouldn't be together, I knew, with a painful certainty, that I would carry the memory of this summer, of him, with me, a secret burning ember, for the rest of my life. When Cody left the next morning, the goodbye was brief, a stilted formality, hiding the unspoken weight of our secret summer. I stood on the porch, watching his car recede down the dusty lane, a growing emptiness opening in my chest as his taillights disappeared around the bend. The cottage felt instantly hollowed out, the silence now deafening, oppressive. I turned back inside, the familiar rooms now echoing with the ghost of his laughter, the phantom touch of his hand, the weight of unspoken words. I retreated into my routine, the familiar motions of my days, but I was irrevocably changed, the quiet surface of my life shattered, the forbidden desires awakened that summer now a restless current beneath the calm facade. The summer had awakened something in me I thought long dead, a dangerous, thrilling longing I knew I could never truly satisfy, and that realization was a constant, aching presence. The cottage stood as it always had, silent, watchful, holding the secrets within its weathered walls. The whispers of that summer would forever echo in its halls, a haunting testament to the forbidden, fevered love that had briefly, impossibly, bloomed within its sheltered walls. And as I stood there, in the sudden, stark silence, I knew I would carry those whispers, that secret fire, with me always, a bittersweet, dangerous ache in the quiet corners of my heart. After Cody left, the cottage settled into a silence deeper than before, a silence that pressed in on me, amplified the emptiness. Even the sounds of the Maine summer, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, seemed muted, distant, as if the world itself had dimmed, mirroring the fading light within me. I tried to force myself back into my routines, the familiar rhythms of life in the cottage, but everything felt hollow, a charade. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in, suffocating me with the weight of unspoken desires and impossible longings. John, as ever, was absorbed in his own quiet world, his presence a constant, oblivious anchor in the storm raging inside me. He didn't seem to notice the change, the tremor that ran beneath my quiet surface, the shadow that had settled in my eyes. Or if he did, he gave no sign. our interactions remaining as they always were, brief, polite, practical. I wondered, with a dull ache, if he felt the shift in the air between us, the subtle widening of the chasm, or if he was simply, as always, lost in his own world, oblivious to the silent dramas unfolding around him, and within me the days blurred, each indistinguishable from the last, a monotonous landscape stretching endlessly before me. I threw myself into chores, scrubbing floors, weeding the garden with a fierce intensity, trying to exhaust myself into numbness, but thoughts of Cody were always there, a persistent undercurrent beneath every action. I replayed stolen moments in my mind, the heat of his gaze, the brush of his skin, the whispered words on the porch, each memory a sharp, bittersweet pang. I thought of the kiss, the reckless abandon, the forbidden thrill, and the guilt that followed, a cold, constant ache that settled deep in my bones. One evening, seeking some solace, some connection to the memory of that stolen summer, I found myself on the porch, watching the sun bleed across the sky. Almost involuntarily, my hand reached for the letter Cody had sent, tucked away in a drawer like a forbidden treasure. It had arrived a few days after he left, and I had read it countless times, the paper softened and worn with the weight of my secret readings. His words, even weeks later, held a potent charge, a reminder of the illicit connection we had shared. He wrote of the cottage, of the summer, of the impossibility of forgetting, of a yearning that echoed my own unspoken desires. He didn't name our kiss, our forbidden feelings, but they pulsed between the lines, unspoken yet undeniable, a silent, shared language of longing. Reading his letter was a strange mix of solace and agony, a bittersweet torment. It was a tangible link to what we had shared, a reminder that it had been real, that I hadn't imagined the fire that had burned between us. But it was also a stark reminder of what could never be, a painful echo of a door slammed shut, a path irrevocably closed. I folded the worn letter carefully, tracing the lines of his handwriting one last time, and tucked it back into its hiding place, my heart heavy with the weight of unspoken desires and impossible realities. As weeks melted into months, the illusion of normalcy began to fray at the edges. I tried to convince myself that life would, return to its predictable quietude. I told myself that the summer with Cody was a fleeting fever dream, a momentary lapse, a dangerous infatuation that would eventually fade, as all such reckless desires must. But deep down, beneath the brittle facade of routine, I knew it was a lie. The connection we had forged, forbidden and dangerous as it was, had been too real, too potent to simply vanish. It had irrevocably altered the landscape of my heart, awakened a part of me that refused to be quieted, leaving a raw, aching void in its wake. One ordinary afternoon, as I tended to the roses in the garden, their thorns mirroring the sharp edges of my inner turmoil, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. My breath hitched, my heart leaping with a sudden, irrational surge of hope. For a fleeting, foolish moment, I allowed myself to believe it was Cody, returned, somehow, impossibly, to shatter the quiet monotony and rekindle the forbidden flame. But as the car rounded the bend, the sunlight glinting off its windshield, I saw it was Sarah, Cody's mother, not Cody himself. A wave of mingled relief and disappointment washed over me, relief that it wasn't the dangerous, impossible fulfillment of my reckless hope, disappointment at the continued absence, the stark reality of what could never be. "Margaret," she called out, stepping from the car, her smile warm and genuine, oblivious to the storm raging beneath my carefully composed surface. "It's so good to see you." I forced a smile in return, a brittle imitation of warmth, and greeted her, desperately trying to push back the turbulent emotions that threatened to breach my carefully constructed composure. We settled onto the porch. The familiar creak of the swing set a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of my heart. We sipped iced tea, the clinking of glasses a fragile sound in the heavy silence of unspoken things, and made polite conversation, catching up on family news, the banalities of everyday life. Sarah spoke of Cody, of his life in the city, his new job, his budding future. I listened, nodding, murmuring polite responses, but inside, a deep, hollow ache resonated, a constant, dull throb beneath the surface of polite smiles and social graces. It was a stark, painful reminder of the chasm that separated our worlds, the impossibility of bridging the divide, the finality of his absence, and the enduring emptiness he had left behind after Sarah's departure, leaving me alone once more with the ghosts of the summer and the weight of my unspoken desires. I found myself wandering back to the garden, drawn by an unseen force. I stood amidst the roses, their vibrant blooms now fading, petals scattering like lost hopes on the parched earth. My gaze fell upon the tulips, the ones Cody and I had planted together, now in full, defiant bloom, their colors a stark, vibrant reminder of a life that felt both impossibly distant and achingly present. I thought of stolen moments, whispered words, forbidden touches, the laughter that echoed only in memory now, the unspoken connection that had drawn us together, across the boundaries of propriety and sense. And I thought of the future, a vast, empty landscape stretching before me, the weight of choices made, and the impossible choices yet to face, the slow, quiet erosion of a life lived in the shadow of unspoken desires and unfulfilled longings. I knew, with a cold, stark certainty, that what had sparked between Cody and I could never last, not in the light of day, not in the real world. It was a fleeting, forbidden fire, a reckless moment in time, a dangerous illusion. But it had also been a brutal, necessary reminder of something I had almost forgotten, the capacity to feel, to desire, to truly be alive, even in the teeth of impossibility. And for that painful, dangerous awakening, for the brutal reignition of a heart I thought had long since turned to ash, I knew, with a strange, twisted gratitude, I would always be cursed and blessed. As the sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and fading gold, I stood there in the garden, the scent of dying roses heavy in the air, and made a silent, fragile promise to myself, a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I would carry the memory of that summer, the weight of that forbidden fire, within me, a secret ache in the quiet spaces of my heart. But I would also try to let it go, try to bury it deep, beneath the layers of routine, beneath the weight of years and duty, and the quiet resignation of my life. I would return to my life, to the cottage, to John, and attempt, somehow, to navigate the empty landscape stretching before me, to find a way to move forward, even if it meant carrying a part of myself, a vital, dangerous, yearning part, forever locked away, forever lost, forever mourned. The cottage stood, as always, silent, watchful, a sentinel of secrets and unspoken desires. The whispers of that summer, the ghost of a forbidden love, would forever echo in its weathered walls, a testament to the dangerous, impossible bloom that had briefly, brutally, ignited within its sheltered confines. And as I stood there, in the gathering twilight, watching the sun sink below the horizon, extinguishing the last embers of day, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would carry those whispers, that secret fire, that bittersweet, dangerous ache, with me, always, until the final, quiet dusk descended on my own life. Time passed, a slow, relentless erosion of days into weeks, weeks into months, months into a numb, unending year. Yet, beneath the surface of routine, my thoughts, like a persistent undercurrent, kept returning to Cody, not with a hopeful longing, but with a haunted, bittersweet ache. I tried to lose myself in the mundane rhythms of daily life, the relentless cycle of cleaning, gardening, cooking, but his image lingered unbidden in the quiet corners of my mind, a phantom presence in the empty spaces of the cottage. I remembered stolen moments, whispered words, the dangerous heat of his gaze, the illicit thrill of his touch, each memory a sharp, poignant pang, a ghostly echo of what could never be. And every time, inevitably, my thoughts circled back to the forbidden kiss on the porch, the reckless surrender, the brief, terrifying taste of a life I could never have. The memory was a brand, burned deep into the fabric of my being, a constant, aching reminder of a fire that had ignited, burned fiercely, and then been brutally extinguished, leaving behind only ashes and a lingering, unbearable smoke. John remained unchanged, a quiet, steadfast presence beside me, a familiar stranger. He remained lost in his own world, absorbed in the predictable rhythms of his days, oblivious, or perhaps deliberately blind, to the silent storm raging within me. Our life together continued, a pale imitation of companionship, but it felt emptier now, hollowed out, as if the brief, forbidden spark of connection I had found with Cody had only served to illuminate the vast, desolate void that had been silently growing between John and I for years, a chasm now widened, deepened, by the ghost of a summer that could never be forgotten. I made a perfunctory attempt, now and again, to bridge the growing gap, to reach out to John, to rekindle some flicker of the warmth we had once shared, but it was always futile, a hollow gesture, a performance of connection in a life that had become a carefully constructed performance of normalcy. We had both grown too accustomed to the silence, the distance, the comfortable, barren routine, that breaking through the wall between us, now, felt like an insurmountable task, a hopeless, exhausting endeavor. One evening, months into the endless, aching quietude, as we sat together on the porch, the silence between us heavier than usual, I felt a sudden, desperate urge to break through, to shatter the careful facade of normalcy, to confess the secret that had been eating away at me from the inside out. "John," I began, my voice trembling, barely audible above the hum of crickets, "there's something I need to tell you." The words hung in the air between us, fragile, dangerous, a thread threatening to unravel the carefully woven tapestry of our silence.